Chapter 1. Whispers of the Aurora. The train slowed as it approached the station, the hiss of steam rising into the icy night air. Outside the window, the world was a vast expanse of white, the snow reflecting the faint hues of the northern lights that painted the sky in rippling greens and purples. Iris tightened her grip on the violin case resting on her lap, her fingers brushing against the worn leather strap as if seeking reassurance. She had told herself this journey was necessary, that leaving the chaos of the city behind would help her find peace. Yet, as the train ground to a halt, an unfamiliar unease coiled in her chest. A voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their arrival in the small Arctic town of Uljustal. Iris stood, adjusting the scarf around her neck and pulling on her gloves. The cold seeped through the train's thin walls, promising an even harsher welcome outside. She stepped onto the platform, her boots crunching against the packed snow, and paused to take in her surroundings. The town was quiet, almost eerily so. Its cobblestone streets lined with quaint wooden houses adorned with twinkling fairy lights. In the distance, the silhouette of a towering church spire pierced the sky, a beacon against the shimmering backdrop of the auroras. The air smelled of pine and frost, a stark contrast to the bustling, smog-filled streets of the city she had left behind. "You must be Iris," a voice called out, pulling her from her thoughts. A wiry man in a thick fur-lined coat approached, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I'm Oscar, from the boarding house. Welcome to Uljustal." Iris nodded, her voice catching in her throat before she managed to respond. "Thank you." Oscar offered her a polite smile and gestured toward a sled loaded with her luggage. "It's a short walk to the house. The streets are too narrow for cars, but I assure you, it's cozy once we get there." As they made their way through the snow-covered streets, Oscar began to talk, his tone warm and conversational. The Snowlight Serenade is what brings most people here this time of year. Musicians from all over come to perform, and it's quite the spectacle. Have you heard the legend? Iris shook her head, clutching the strap of her violin case as they trudged onward. "No, I haven't." Oscar's eyes gleamed, his voice lowering as though sharing a secret. "They say the auroras have a magic of their own, that they amplify the music played during the serenade. It's why people call it the Snowlight Serenade. Some even believe the lights respond to the melodies, creating patterns that tell stories." Iris raised an eyebrow but said nothing, unsure if she should entertain the notion of magical auroras. The concept seemed almost too whimsical, too distant from the harsh realities she had faced in recent months. Yet, there was something about Oscar's sincerity that made her hesitate to dismiss it entirely. They reached the boarding house, a charming structure with a steeply sloped roof and a porch adorned with lanterns. Inside, the warmth enveloped her instantly, the scent of cinnamon and cloves wafting from the kitchen. Oscar led her upstairs to a modest but comfortable room. The window offered a view of the town square, where a towering spruce tree stood adorned with ornaments that sparkled like stars. Once alone, Iris set her violin case on the bed and unlatched it with a practiced motion. The instrument gleamed in the dim light, its polished surface reflecting her weary expression. She ran her fingers along the strings, a pang of longing swelling in her chest. Music had always been her sanctuary, but since the incident, every note felt like a reminder of what she had lost. She closed the case abruptly, rising to stand by the window. Below, townsfolk moved about, their laughter and chatter muffled by the glass. She could see a young couple twirling in the snow, their scarves trailing behind them like ribbons. The sight tugged at something deep within her, a bittersweet ache she couldn't quite name. A knock at the door startled her. She turned to find Oscar standing there, holding a folded piece of parchment. "This came for you," he said, placing it on the small desk before retreating with a nod. Iris hesitated before picking it up. The paper was old and slightly crinkled, the handwriting elegant and precise. The note was brief but enigmatic. Under the auroras, where light meets sound, truths long buried shall be found. Her pulse quickened as she read the words again. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. She glanced toward the violin case, a strange resolve settling over her. The Snowlight Serenade was more than just an event. It was a mystery, one she hadn't planned on unraveling but now felt compelled to confront. That night, as the auroras danced above and the town settled into slumber, Iris stood by the window, her thoughts a tangled web of questions. The cold glass against her palm grounded her as she made a silent promise. Whatever secrets this town held, she would uncover them, and perhaps, in the process, she might find a way to mend the fractured melody of her own heart. Chapter 2. Strings of the Heart. The morning air was sharp and unforgiving as Iris stepped out of the boarding house, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the cold. The snow underfoot crunched with each step, a crisp rhythm to accompany the quiet hum of the town waking up. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her violin case slung over one shoulder, and followed the faint sound of bells chiming from the town square. Justel was more alive in the daylight than she had expected. Small shops lining the cobblestone streets opened their doors, releasing warmth and the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked pastries. Children bundled in wool coats darted through the snow, their laughter echoing against the wooden facades of the buildings. Iris caught sight of an elderly woman stringing bright red ribbons along a fence, her gloved hands trembling slightly with age but steady in purpose. The sight stirred something faintly nostalgic in Iris, an ache for a life she no longer recognized. She paused at the edge of the square, where a small crowd had gathered around a man playing a lively tune on an accordion. His music was bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to the solemn melodies that played in Iris's mind. A girl with a tambourine joined in, adding a rhythmic clatter that made the crowd clap along. It was infectious, this joy, but Iris couldn't bring herself to linger. She turned away, her boots leaving shallow imprints in the snow as she headed toward the church spire she'd seen the night before. The church stood on a gentle hill overlooking the town, its doors framed by arches of ice that glinted like diamonds in the pale sunlight. As Iris approached, she noticed a figure crouched by the steps, adjusting what appeared to be a wooden sculpture. The man's gloved hands worked deftly, brushing snow off the intricate carvings of a violin perched atop a pile of music sheets. "It's beautiful," she said before she could stop herself. Her voice startled the man, and he turned sharply, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. He was younger than she had expected, his dark hair flecked with snow and his face etched with a weariness that mirrored her own. "Thank you," he replied after a moment, his voice low and steady. He straightened, brushing his hands off on his coat. "It's for the serenade." "You're an artist?" Iris asked, stepping closer to examine the sculpture. The details were extraordinary. The texture of the wood mimicked the grain of a real violin, and the music sheets bore tiny, carved notes as though frozen mid-composition. The man hesitated, his gaze flickering to the violin case on her shoulder. "I suppose you could say that. Ethan," he added, extending a gloved hand. "Ethan Carver." "Iris." She shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip despite the cold. "You're involved in the serenade?" Ethan's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as though the question had dredged up an unwelcome memory. "Not anymore," he said, his tone clipped. "I just help with the decorations." He turned back to the sculpture, adjusting its placement as if to dismiss the subject. Iris watched him for a moment, curiosity tugging at her. There was a story there, she was certain of it, but something in Ethan's demeanor warned her not to pry. Instead, She nodded toward the church doors. "Is it open?" "It should be," Ethan replied without looking at her. "Father Mickle's usually inside this time of day." Iris murmured her thanks and ascended the steps, pushing open one of the heavy wooden doors. The warmth inside was immediate, a stark contrast to the chill outside. The interior of the church was simple but elegant, its high ceilings adorned with beams of polished wood. Candles flickered along the walls, their soft glow casting shadows that danced with the faint drafts of air. At the front of the church, a man in a long, dark robe knelt in quiet prayer. He rose as Iris approached, his kind eyes crinkling with a smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying a gentle authority. "You must be new to Justel." "I just arrived last night," Iris replied. "I'm staying at the boarding house." Oscar mentioned the serenade. The priest nodded, clasping his hands in front of him. "Ah, yes. It's the heart of our town, especially during this season. Are you here to participate?" "I'm not sure yet," Iris admitted. Her gaze drifted to the grand piano at the front of the church, its glossy surface reflecting the candlelight. The sight stirred a mixture of longing and dread within her. "I haven't played in a long time." Father Mickle regarded her thoughtfully. "Music has a way of healing wounds we cannot see," he said. "The serenade is not just about performance. It's about connection, about bringing light to the darkest corners of our hearts." His words lingered with Iris as she left the church, her thoughts churning. Outside, Ethan was gone, the sculpture standing solitary against the backdrop of snow. She traced her fingers over the carved violin, the wood smooth and cold beneath her touch. The memory of the note she had received the night before resurfaced, its cryptic message echoing in her mind. "Under the auroras, where light meets sound, truths long buried shall be found." The wind picked up as she descended the hill, carrying with it a haunting melody. She paused, turning toward the source, but the streets below were empty. The music faded as quickly as it had come, leaving her with the uneasy sensation that it had been meant for her ears alone. Back at the boarding house, Iris sat by the window, her violin resting on her lap. She traced the edges of the instrument, her fingers trembling as she lifted the bow. Tentatively, she drew it across the strings, the note wobbly and uncertain, but unmistakably alive. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost, hope. And beneath the auroras that night, as their light danced across the town, Iris resolved to uncover the secrets of the Snowlight Serenade, no matter where they might lead her. Chapter 3: A Fragile Glow. The sun hung low in the pale winter sky as Iris wandered through the narrow streets of Justel. The warmth of the morning had given way to a biting chill, the kind that gnawed at her fingertips despite her gloves. She clutched her violin case closer, its familiar weight both a comfort and a burden. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. The cryptic note she had received was tucked safely in her coat pocket, but its words seemed to echo louder with each step she took. Under the auroras, where light meets sound, truths long buried shall be found. What truths? What light? And why her? The questions swirled in her mind like snow caught in the wind, refusing to settle. As she passed a shop with frosted windows, a flash of movement caught her eye. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood on the opposite side of the street, half hidden in the shadow of a narrow alley. Their silhouette was sharp and still, their face obscured by a scarf and hat. For a moment, they seemed to meet her gaze, and then, without a word, they disappeared into the darkness. Iris hesitated. Her instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to keep moving, but curiosity gnawed at her resolve. She crossed the street, her boots crunching through the snow, and peered into the alley. It was empty save for a trail of footprints leading toward the edge of town. Shivering, she stepped back and quickened her pace, the encounter leaving her more unsettled than ever. The trail led her to the outskirts of Ljudstal, where the buildings thinned and the forest loomed. Bare branches stretched toward the sky like skeletal hands, their shadows crisscrossing the snow in intricate patterns. A faint melody drifted through the air, barely audible but achingly familiar. It wasn't the joyful tune from the square or the haunting hymn from the church. This melody was different, raw, and unpolished, as if played by someone who hadn't touched an instrument in years. Drawn to the sound, Iris followed it to a clearing where a small wooden cabin stood. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the faint glow of candlelight spilled through its frosted windows. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her heart racing. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the air thick with silence. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped out, his expression as guarded as ever. He held a violin in one hand, the bow dangling loosely from the other. "You again," he said, his voice tinged with surprise and something else. Reluctance, perhaps. "I heard the music," Iris said, her voice steadier than she felt. She gestured toward the violin. "It was you." Ethan's grip on the instrument tightened. "I didn't think anyone would be out here." "Neither did I." She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the cabin. "Do you live here?" He nodded curtly. "When I'm not working in town." Iris stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "The melody you were playing. It sounded familiar." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's just something I've been working on. Nothing special." "It is special," Iris insisted. "There's something about it. It feels important." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. His eyes searched hers, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, gesturing toward the cabin. "You might as well come in. It's too cold to stand out here." Inside, the cabin was small but cozy, its walls lined with shelves filled with books, jars of paint, and various tools. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting a warm glow over the room. Ethan set the violin on a worn table and motioned for Iris to take a seat. "So," he said, leaning against the table, "why are you really here?" Iris hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I came to Ljudstal for the serenade," she said carefully. "But now, I'm not sure. There's something about this place, something I can't explain. And then there's the note." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What note?" She pulled the slip of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. He read it silently, his expression darkening with each word. When he finished, he set it down and rubbed his temples. "Where did you get this?" "It was left in my room at the boarding house," Iris said. "Do you know what it means?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the room and opened a small chest, pulling out a faded envelope. He handed it to her, and her breath caught as she recognized the same handwriting on the front. She unfolded the letter inside, her hands trembling. "Ethan," it read, "under the auroras, where light meets sound, truths long buried shall be found. Follow the music. It will lead you home." Iris looked up at him, her mind reeling. "You got one too?" "Years ago," Ethan said quietly. "I thought it was just some prank. But then, things started happening." "What things?" He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I can't explain it, not yet. But if you're here, if you got the same message, maybe it's not a coincidence." The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Iris's gaze drifted to the violin on the table, its strings glinting in the firelight. The melody she had heard earlier lingered in her mind, intertwining with the cryptic words of the note. "Do you believe in destiny?" she asked softly. Ethan's lips twitched, a hint of a bitter smile crossing his face. I believe in questions without answers. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faintest strains of music. Music that seemed to beckon them both toward something neither could yet understand. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Snow. Night had fallen over Justel, casting the town into a deep, wintry stillness. The faint glow of the auroras rippled across the sky like an ethereal tapestry, their colors shimmering in hues of green, violet, and gold. From her window in the boarding house, Iris watched the celestial display, her thoughts tangled in the events of the day. The cryptic note, Ethan's wary demeanor, the haunting melody, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't yet equipped to solve. But she couldn't deny the pull she felt. Something about this town, this moment in her life, was charged with a purpose she didn't fully understand. And Ethan, the enigmatic inventor with his guarded eyes and hidden pain, seemed to be at the center of it all. A knock at her door startled her. She turned, her pulse quickening, and crossed the room to open it. Ethan stood on the other side, his coat dusted with snow and his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Iris nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He glanced around the room briefly before settling into the chair by the small writing desk. She closed the door and leaned against it, waiting. Ethan's gaze drifted to the violin case resting on the bed. "You're planning to play in the serenade, aren't you?" "I was," she admitted. "But now I'm not so sure." "Why?" She hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the strange unease that had settled over her. "Something about all of this feels bigger than me, like I'm being pulled into something I don't fully understand." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're not wrong. This town, the serenade, even the auroras, there's more to it than most people know." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "The Snowlight Serenade isn't just a tradition. It's tied to something ancient, something that's been part of Justel for generations. People think it's just about music and the auroras, but it's more than that. It's a connection, a bridge between this world and something else." Iris frowned. "Something else?" "I don't know what to call it," Ethan admitted, "but I felt it. Ever since I got that letter, I've been trying to understand what it means. And then you show up with the same note, and I can't help but think it's not a coincidence." She sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind racing. "Do you think the serenade is the key?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just a piece of the puzzle." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window pane. The sound was eerie, almost like a voice calling out in the night. Ethan stood abruptly. "There's something I need to show you." "Now?" she asked, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was well past midnight. He nodded. "It's better at night." Without waiting for her response, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Iris hesitated, then grabbed her coat and followed. They walked through the quiet streets of Justel, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The auroras danced overhead, their light casting an otherworldly glow over the town. Ethan led her to the edge of the forest, where the trees stood like silent sentinels. He paused, turning to her. "What I'm about to show you, you can't tell anyone." She nodded, her heart pounding. "I won't." Satisfied, he led her into the woods. The path was narrow and winding, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots in the snow and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a clearing. At the center stood a massive stone archway, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the aurora's light. It was both beautiful and unsettling, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. "What is this?" Iris whispered, stepping closer. "I don't know." Ethan admitted. But it's been here for as long as anyone can remember. Some people think it's just an old monument, but I've seen it do things. Like what? He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the archway. During the serenade, when the music reaches its peak and the auroras are at their brightest, it's like the archway comes alive. The patterns start to glow, and there's this sound, like a hum that you can feel more than hear. Iris stared at the archway, her mind spinning. And you think it's connected to the notes we got? I think it's connected to everything, Ethan said. The serenade, the auroras, even the town itself. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, and Iris shivered. She looked at Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we supposed to do? We follow the music, he said, and hope it leads us to the truth. As they stood beneath the auroras, the archway looming before them, Iris felt a strange sense of certainty. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she couldn't turn back now. Chapter 5. The Echo of Silence. The stone archway seemed to breathe under the rippling glow of the auroras. Its intricate carvings shimmered faintly, as though holding onto secrets too ancient to articulate. Iris couldn't tear her eyes away, her thoughts consumed by the mesmerizing sight. This archway, this enigma, felt alive, as if it was a sentinel to something profound and forbidden. What did you mean by following the music? Iris asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Her voice sounded small against the vast stillness of the clearing. Ethan's gaze didn't leave the archway. The serenade. The melody has always been unique. It's not just a song. People say the notes hold a resonance that's not entirely of this world. Resonance? Iris echoed, stepping closer to him. He nodded, his face shadowed in the aurora's light. There's something in the way the music aligns with the lights in the sky. Every year, at the climax of the serenade, something happens. People talk about seeing visions, hearing whispers, feeling things they can't explain. And then there's the archway. Iris turned back to the ancient structure. The carvings seemed to shift subtly in the flickering light, their forms almost fluid. What happens to it? It reacts, Ethan said, his voice tinged with both awe and fear. The patterns glow brighter, and the air feels charged, like a storm about to break. And then, well, no one really knows. It's always different. A chill swept through Iris, but she wasn't sure if it came from the icy wind or Ethan's words. You've seen this? Once, he admitted, his tone quieter now. I was a kid. My parents brought me to the serenade. I remember hearing the music, watching the auroras dance, and then, for a moment, it was like the whole world shifted. I saw something. Iris's eyes narrowed. What did you see? Ethan hesitated, as if the memory was too fragile to touch. A figure, just for a moment. It was standing in the archway, like it had stepped out of the lights themselves. I blinked and it was gone. The weight of his confession settled between them. Iris's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the mystery. And the letter? Do you think it's connected to all of this? I'd bet on it, Ethan said. He pulled the folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. The words, the timing, the way it brought us both here. It's too deliberate to be a coincidence. Iris unfolded the note, her fingers trembling slightly. She read the words again, searching for meaning in the cryptic invitation. The serenade begins where the heart of the lights meets the soul of the melody. Her gaze drifted back to the archway. Do you think this is the heart of the lights? It's possible, Ethan said, but if it is, then the soul of the melody must be the music itself. The serenade. They stood in silence, the implications of their discovery settling in. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible hum. Iris tilted her head, straining to hear. Do you hear that? she asked. Ethan froze, listening. What is it? The hum grew louder, taking on a melodic quality. It was hauntingly beautiful, like a song from another world. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, wrapping around them like a ghostly embrace. The music, Iris whispered. It's starting. Ethan's jaw tightened. It shouldn't be. The serenade isn't for another week. Then what is this? She asked, her voice trembling. The melody swirled around them, rising and falling like the tide. The carvings on the archway began to glow faintly, their patterns pulsing in time with the music. The air grew heavier, charged with an almost electric energy. Ethan grabbed her arm. We need to go. But now? Iris, he insisted, pulling her away from the archway. They stumbled back into the forest, the melody growing fainter with each step. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it an eerie sense of foreboding. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the music had faded completely, leaving only the sound of their ragged breaths. Iris turned to Ethan, her heart pounding. What just happened? He shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know, but whatever it was, it's starting. The serenade? She asked. And everything that comes with it, Ethan said. We need to be ready. As they walked back to town, the auroras continued to dance overhead, their light casting long shadows on the snow. Iris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, as if unseen eyes were following their every move. The melody lingered in her mind, its haunting beauty both a comfort and a warning. Whatever lay ahead, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The Snowlight Serenade was more than just a tradition. It was a doorway, and they were about to step through. Chapter 6, Through Frosted Glass. The following morning, the town of Lumina lay bathed in soft light as the first rays of dawn broke over the snow-draped rooftops. The lingering chill of the mysterious melody haunted Iris as she sat in a quiet corner of Ethan's workshop. Every now and then, she glanced at the violin resting on the table before her, its presence both a comfort and a challenge. Ethan moved about the room with an energy that belied the gravity of their shared experience the night before. He adjusted tools, scribbled notes, and occasionally glanced at the intricate mechanism he'd been working on. It resembled a clock but was studded with tiny glass prisms and metallic components that reflected the faint morning light in colorful patterns. Yet, even as he worked, Iris could see the weight in his shoulders, the tension that lingered behind his distracted gestures. You're not going to talk about it, are you? Iris finally asked, breaking the silence. Ethan paused mid-motion, a small screwdriver in hand. He sighed, setting it down with deliberate care. What is there to say? You saw what happened. The music, the archway, it's all real. But we still don't know what it means. That's exactly why we need to talk about it, she pressed. The carvings lit up, Ethan. The melody felt alive, like it was calling us. You can't just ignore that. He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. I'm not ignoring it, Iris. I'm trying to figure out how to keep us safe. If the serenade's starting early, then everything we thought we knew about it is useless. We're stepping into the unknown. Iris's gaze drifted to the violin again. Its polished surface caught the light, reminding her of the fleeting melody that had drawn them to the archway. She traced a finger over its strings, feeling a strange connection to the instrument, a connection she couldn't quite explain. What if the music is a message? She asked softly. Ethan frowned. A message from who? She hesitated. I don't know, but it felt like it was trying to tell us something, or lead us somewhere. Before Ethan could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the workshop door. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting in a brief exchange of uncertainty. Ethan grabbed a rag to wipe his hands, masking his unease as he moved toward the door. When he opened it, a familiar figure stepped inside, Eliza, the town's librarian and one of its most enigmatic residents. Eliza's presence always carried an air of mystery. Today was no exception. Her dark cloak was dusted with snow, and her sharp green eyes seemed to pierce through whatever barriers people tried to put up. She carried a leather-bound book, its edges frayed with age. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I heard about your little midnight adventure." Ethan's jaw tightened. News travels fast. "In Lumina, it always does," Eliza replied with a faint smile. She turned her attention to Iris. "And you must be the violinist everyone's been talking about. Welcome to the heart of the serenade." Iris felt a shiver run through her, though Eliza's words carried no malice. "I didn't realize the serenade was such a big deal," she said cautiously. "It's more than a big deal," Eliza said, her tone dropping into something almost reverent. She placed the book on the workbench and opened it to a page filled with detailed sketches of the archway. The serenade isn't just a tradition. It's a legacy. And if what I've been hearing is true, then this year might be the most important one yet. Ethan leaned over the book, his brow furrowing as he studied the sketches. "What makes you say that?" Eliza's gaze flickered to Iris. "Because the music has chosen its players, and it always starts with the violinist." Iris's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Eliza turned the page, revealing a series of handwritten notes alongside more sketches. Every serenade begins with a violinist. They're the first to hear the melody, the first to feel its pull. The music draws them into its story, its purpose. And from there, the others follow. "Others?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with skepticism. Eliza nodded. "The serenade gathers its players, a group of individuals whose roles are woven into its tapestry. Each one is drawn to the melody for a reason, and together, they unlock the archway's secrets." Iris stared at the sketches, her mind racing. "And what happens when the archway's secrets are unlocked?" Eliza's expression darkened. "That depends on the choices you make. The serenade is both a gift and a test. It reveals truths, but it also demands sacrifices." The room fell into a heavy silence. Iris felt the weight of Eliza's words settling on her shoulders, as if the melody itself had chosen her for a task she didn't fully understand. She glanced at Ethan, whose face was unreadable, and then back to the violin. The instrument seemed to hum with unspoken possibilities, its strings waiting to be played. Finally, Eliza closed the book and straightened. "The serenade has already begun. You don't have much time. If you want answers, you'll need to follow the music." As Eliza turned to leave, Iris called after her. "Wait, how do we follow it?" Eliza paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the pale morning light. "Trust your instincts. The music will guide you. But be careful. Not every path it reveals is safe." With that, she stepped into the snow, leaving Iris and Ethan alone with the weight of her revelations. The air in the workshop felt charged, as if the melody itself was waiting for them to take the next step. "This is insane," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Music that chooses players, archways that react to it. It's like something out of a fairy tale." "Maybe," Iris said quietly, "but what if it's real? What if we're meant to be part of it?" Ethan met her gaze, his eyes filled with uncertainty. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a resigned sigh, he gestured toward the violin. "If we're going to do this, we'll need to be ready," he said. "Let's start with the music." As Iris picked up the violin and drew the bow across the strings, the haunting melody from the previous night began to fill the room. It was softer now, more controlled, but no less powerful. And as the notes swirled around them, Iris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, their every move observed by something unseen. The serenade had chosen them, and there was no turning back. Chapter 7. The Language of Light. The first notes of the melody rippled through the frosted air, sending a shiver down Iris's spine. Each stroke of the bow felt deliberate, almost guided by an unseen force. Ethan stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her as though trying to decipher the invisible threads connecting her to the music. The haunting tune filled the workshop, curling like smoke into every corner, yet it seemed to stretch beyond the walls. Iris played as if compelled, her fingers moving instinctively over the strings. The resonance of the notes felt like a conversation, a dialogue between herself and something much older than she could comprehend. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavy, laden with meaning she couldn't grasp. Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the chilly air, and stepped forward. "It's the same melody from last night," he said. His voice was quiet but firm, as if he didn't want to disturb the stillness that had settled over them. "But it's clearer now, like it's trying to tell us something more." Iris lowered the violin and shook her head, her brow furrowed. "It feels like it's guiding me, but to what? Eliza said the serenade gathers its players, but I don't understand why. Why us? Why now?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond but stopped as a faint sound reached their ears, a distant echo, soft and rhythmic, like footsteps crunching on snow. They both turned toward the workshop door, their breath hitching. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it stopped just outside. A knock followed, sharp and deliberate. Ethan and Iris exchanged a glance, tension crackling between them. He moved cautiously toward the door, his hand hesitating on the handle before pulling it open. Standing in the doorway was a man wrapped in a heavy fur-lined coat, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide hat. His presence was imposing, yet his expression was unreadable. Snowflakes clung to his shoulders, and his piercing gray eyes seemed to survey the room with practiced precision. "Ethan Holloway?" the man asked, his voice rough like gravel. Ethan nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the cold following him like a specter. He removed his hat, revealing a weathered face etched with deep lines. "Name's Commander Adler. I'm with the Northern Expeditionary Society." Ethan stiffened. "I haven't been part of the society in years. If you're here to recruit me, you're wasting your time." Adler's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a recruitment. It's a warning." Iris stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "A warning? About what?" Adler's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, his hardened expression softened. "You must be the violinist," he said. "Then you're already caught in it." "Caught in what?" she pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Adler looked between them before finally speaking. "The Snowlight Serenade. You've stirred something that's been dormant for decades. The melody, the archway, the carvings, they're all part of a puzzle that should never have been touched. And if you keep going, you'll awaken what's on the other side." Ethan frowned. "What's on the other side?" Adler's face darkened. "A force older than this town, older than any of us. It's not just music, it's a gateway. And the last time it was opened, it nearly destroyed everything." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Iris felt a chill deeper than the cold air outside. She tightened her grip on the violin, its familiar weight suddenly feeling ominous. "You're saying we should stop," Ethan said, his voice low. "I'm saying you must stop," Adler corrected. "The serenade doesn't just gather players. It binds them to its will. And once you're bound, there's no turning back." Iris's heart pounded in her chest. "But what if we're meant to see this through? What if stopping isn't an option?" Adler's gaze hardened. "Then you'd better be prepared to face the consequences. The serenade doesn't give without taking something in return." Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "Why now? Why is it happening again after all this time?" Adler hesitated. then reached into his coat and pulled out a faded photograph. He handed it to Ethan, who studied it with a growing sense of unease. Iris leaned over his shoulder and saw an image of a group of people standing in front of the same archway they'd seen the night before. The figures were young, smiling, and familiar. Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "This is from the last serenade." Adler nodded grimly. "And only one of them survived." The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Iris couldn't tear her eyes from the photograph. The smiling faces felt like a warning, a reminder of the dangers they were walking into. "You have a choice," Adler said, his voice firm. "Turn away now and let the serenade fade back into silence. Or follow it to the end and face whatever lies beyond that archway. But if you choose the second path, know this: the serenade doesn't forgive mistakes." With that, he turned and walked out into the snow, leaving the door ajar. Ethan moved to close it, his hands trembling slightly. The workshop felt colder than ever, the walls pressing in with the weight of unspoken truths. Iris sank into a chair, clutching the violin as if it were a lifeline. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan stared at the photograph in his hand, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "We keep going," he said, "but we'll do it on our terms. If the serenade wants players, then we'll play. But we'll find out what it's hiding and why it chose us." Iris nodded, her resolve hardening. The melody was already pulling them forward, and there was no turning back. Together, they would follow the music, even if it led them into the unknown. Chapter 8. A Symphony of Secrets. Iris stood on the edge of the frozen lake, the northern lights swirling above her in vibrant waves of green, purple, and blue. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but she hardly noticed it. Her mind was elsewhere, deep within the echo of the song that had danced in her soul since the moment she'd arrived in the small Arctic town. It was as though the lights above were pulling something from her, unraveling the tightly wound knot of grief and loss that had taken residence within her heart for so long. It had been days since Ethan's confession, his quiet words revealing the truth of his involvement in the Snowlight Serenade's legacy. Yet the more she pondered his past, the less certain she became. Ethan wasn't just the enigmatic inventor who created music boxes and strange mechanical wonders. He was more, something deeper, something she had yet to understand. The days had drifted by, filled with rehearsals for the upcoming performance, each moment punctuated by the soft, melodic strains of violin and piano. Iris had taken solace in their music, a quiet balm to her soul. But she couldn't deny that something was shifting between them, an invisible thread pulling her closer to Ethan, even though she couldn't bring herself to fully trust him. As she lingered on the frozen shore, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning slowly, she found Ethan standing there, his dark eyes gleaming in the pale light, a look of uncertainty in his gaze. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said softly, his voice gentle as the wind that swirled around them. Iris studied him for a moment, her fingers twitching toward the violin case resting at her side. She wanted to play, to let the music speak for her, but the words were already gathering on the tip of her tongue. "You've been distant," she replied, her voice firmer than she had intended. "Are you still hiding something?" Ethan sighed, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'm not hiding anything from you, Iris. At least not what you think." She took a step closer, the snow crunching beneath her boots. "You say that, but I know you're keeping things from me. I can feel it." Her gaze softened, a silent plea in her eyes. "What is it? What really happened to your father? To the music?" Ethan remained silent for a long moment, the wind carrying the weight of his unspoken words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I promised myself I wouldn't tell anyone this. But I suppose it's time. Iris held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. My father, he wasn't just a musician. He was the one who designed the first Snowlight Serenade, the very one that everyone gathers to celebrate every year. It wasn't meant to be just a festival, Ethan's voice faltered, but he steadied himself. It was supposed to be something more, something that could heal people, bring them peace. But he became obsessed with it. The idea that music could heal wounds, change the world, and it drove him to madness. Iris took a step back, a flicker of shock passing over her features. Madness? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Ethan continued, his eyes dark with the weight of the memory. He became consumed by the idea of perfecting the serenade. And one night, he disappeared. No one ever found him. But before he left, he entrusted me with the final piece of his creation, the melody that would complete the serenade. He believed it could change everything, but he never got to finish it. The silence stretched between them, the weight of his words settling in Iris's chest like a heavy stone. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the shock of his revelation left her speechless. Ethan looked down, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. I was supposed to find a way to finish it, but I didn't. I was too afraid of the consequences. And now, the serenade. It's become a tradition, a ghost of what it was meant to be. But this year, I think it might be different. Iris's heart thudded in her chest as she took a tentative step forward. What do you mean? Ethan met her gaze, his eyes full of a quiet resolve. I think you're the key. The music you play, it's unlike anything I've heard before. You're not just playing notes. You're bringing it to life, Iris. And maybe, together, we can finish what my father started. Maybe this year, the serenade can be what he always dreamed it could be. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around them in an unearthly dance, as if the very air held its breath. Iris's heart raced, the weight of Ethan's words settling in. Could it be true? Could she, a woman haunted by her own past, truly be the one to finish the serenade? To change something so deeply ingrained in the town's traditions? The question lingered in the cold air between them, but before Iris could respond, a sudden crackling sound echoed across the lake. She turned, startled, her eyes searching the horizon. In the distance, faint lights shimmered, faint traces of movement flickering like ghosts across the frozen expanse. "What's that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan's face paled, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the scene. It's happening again. Iris's pulse quickened as she realized the lights weren't just the northern lights reflecting in the ice. They were something more, something tied to the serenade, something that couldn't be explained by science or reason. Ethan stepped closer to her, his voice low and urgent. "We need to go. Now." Without waiting for her response, he grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the edge of the lake. As they hurried through the snow, Iris felt the weight of his words press down on her heart, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than either of them, was unfolding right before their eyes. And the Snowlight Serenade, it had only just begun. Chapter 9. Cracks in the Ice. Iris's breath came in shallow gasps as Ethan led her across the frozen lake, the eerie lights ahead growing brighter with each passing step. The snow crunched beneath their feet, an unrelenting reminder of the chilling cold that pressed in on them from all sides. But it wasn't the cold that gripped her. It was the fear, the confusion swirling like a storm within her chest. She couldn't deny it any longer. Something was happening. Something strange and beyond explanation. The lights that flickered in the distance, the eerie hum of the air, the unsettling urgency in Ethan's voice. It all pointed to something they hadn't yet understood. "I don't understand," she said, her voice hoarse as they pushed forward. "What's happening, Ethan? Why are we running toward it?" Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the shimmering lights ahead, his grip on her hand firm yet gentle. "I don't fully understand it either," he admitted, his voice filled with a quiet tension. "But I know it's connected to the serenade, to the music, to my father's legacy. There's something about this year. The stars have aligned in a way they never have before. I think the serenade is about to reveal its true power." They reached the edge of the lake, where the snow began to thin, revealing patches of ice that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. The air around them hummed with an energy that made Iris's skin tingle. She could feel it now, too, the pull of something ancient, something powerful. "I don't know if I can do this," Iris whispered, the weight of Ethan's words still heavy in her heart. "What if I'm not the key? What if we're just playing into something we don't understand?" Ethan stopped, turning to face her. His expression was soft, yet there was an intensity in his eyes that Iris had never seen before. "You're not alone in this, Iris. We're in this together. I may not know what's coming, but I know you're meant to be here. You're meant to finish what my father started." Her heart fluttered in her chest at his words, but doubt lingered. What if she failed? What if the serenade wasn't the answer they were hoping for? But before she could voice her fears, the lights ahead shifted, swirling like a dance of colors. It was as if the very sky had opened up, revealing the secrets that had remained hidden for so long. The air vibrated with a strange melody, a faint sound that seemed to echo from far beyond, and Iris could feel the music, deep within her soul, calling to her. She stepped forward, the snow beneath her boots now soft and yielding, as if the earth itself was urging her onward. The lights grew brighter, pulling her in, and for the first time, Iris didn't resist. She moved toward them, as though something in her body was finally ready to face the truth. Ethan was right beside her, his presence a steady anchor as they moved closer to the source of the light. The music intensified, wrapping around them like a blanket of warmth. It was as if the serenade itself had taken on a life of its own, a force beyond human comprehension. As they reached the center of the lake, the lights converged above them, a swirling vortex of shimmering colors that filled the sky. The air crackled with energy, and Iris could feel the ground beneath her feet humming with power. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the growing music. "This is where it all began. My father was here, on this very spot, when he created the serenade. And now it's our turn." Iris's heart raced in her chest as the realization sank in. She was standing at the heart of something far bigger than herself, something that had been waiting for years, perhaps even centuries, for this moment to unfold. And she was part of it. She closed her eyes, her fingers instinctively reaching for the violin case at her side. Without thinking, she opened it, the familiar weight of the instrument grounding her. The music, still faint in the distance, called to her once more. She lifted the bow, her fingers moving with a fluidity she hadn't felt in years. As the first note floated into the air, she felt it, an undeniable connection, a thread pulling her deeper into the music, into the very heart of the serenade. The sound was pure, crystalline, as though it had always existed, waiting for her to unlock it. Ethan watched her intently, his expression a mixture of awe and something deeper, something unspoken. He stepped closer, his presence a silent support as she continued to play. The music flowed from her like a river, a symphony of emotions pouring out with each stroke of the bow. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, she felt the melody shift, transform. The notes changed, deepened, and the air around them vibrated with an almost palpable energy. It was as if the serenade itself was coming alive, responding to the music she was playing. Iris didn't stop, even as the sky above her seemed to shimmer and pulse with light. She played with every ounce of her being, her heart and soul entwined with the music, with the serenade. She felt the weight of her past lifting, the grief and sorrow that had held her captive for so long slowly melting away. In that moment, she was free. The ground beneath them trembled, the light growing brighter until it enveloped them completely. Iris felt herself being drawn upward, as though the very fabric of the world was unraveling around her, pulling her into the heart of the serenade. She couldn't stop playing, couldn't stop the flood of emotions pouring from her. And through it all, she felt Ethan's presence beside her, a constant, grounding force in the midst of the chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music reached its peak. The lights exploded in a burst of color, enveloping the sky and the land in a brilliant display of light and sound. Iris's breath caught in her throat, her body trembling with the intensity of the moment. The serenade had come to life, and she had finished it. The world around them settled into silence, the echoes of the music lingering in the air like a distant memory. The lights above faded, leaving only the stars and the quiet hum of the frozen lake beneath their feet. Iris lowered her violin, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had finished the serenade. But as she turned to Ethan, her heart racing, she saw the look on his face. A look of awe, but also of something more, something she couldn't quite place. He stepped closer to her, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Iris," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done it. You've brought it to life." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper as she answered him. "We've done it." And for the first time in a long while, Iris felt a sense of peace. A sense that, somehow, despite the struggles and the pain, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 10. The Midnight Waltz. The stillness that followed the crescendo of music and light felt almost sacred. The wind, once howling in the distance, had stilled, as though the very world was holding its breath. Ethan stood beside Iris, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, both of them surrounded by the aftermath of the serenade's awakening. The northern lights above them had softened, now a gentle ripple of colors stretching across the sky, like the remnants of a dream fading at dawn. The air was thick with the weight of what had just occurred. The air around them hummed with a quiet energy, like the last note of a symphony reverberating long after the final chord. Iris lowered her violin, her hands still trembling from the raw emotion she had poured into the music. The sounds of the serenade still lingered in her mind, haunting her in the best possible way. Her body felt light, as though the heavy burden of her past had been swept away by the power of the music. She had given everything to that moment, and in return, it had given her something more precious than she had ever imagined. But even amidst the triumph, a lingering question gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. She turned to Ethan, her eyes searching his face. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We've done it, but what happens next?" Ethan met her gaze, his dark eyes filled with something that resembled awe, but also something deeper, a storm of emotions that he hadn't yet shared. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke, though there was a quiet tremor in his words. "I don't know, Iris," he admitted. "This was more than I ever imagined it would be. But I think this is only the beginning." Iris frowned, the uncertainty creeping back into her chest. The beginning? Of what? Ethan glanced up at the shimmering sky, his expression distant. The serenade. It was always meant to do more than just bring people together for one night. My father, he believed that music could change the world. He thought that through the serenade, people could heal, that it could bridge the gaps between us, help us understand each other in ways words couldn't. But I think it was always about more than just the music. It was about the connection, the feeling, the emotion that binds us. Iris took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. And now, we've unlocked that emotion, the power of the serenade. Ethan nodded slowly. It's not just a song, Iris. It's an experience. Something that changes everything. And now, I think it's our responsibility to make sure the serenade reaches its full potential, to share it with the world, so it can heal people, just like my father wanted. The weight of his words settled in her chest, heavy but hopeful. She knew this wasn't something that could be ignored or left behind. She could feel it in her bones, the responsibility that had been thrust upon them. But the thought of sharing this incredible power with others, of helping people heal, of bringing them closer together, it was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Iris admitted, her voice small. I've spent so long running from my own past, from my own pain. I'm not sure I can handle something so important. Ethan stepped closer to her, his eyes softening. You don't have to do it alone, Iris. We're in this together. We've already taken the first step, and now we'll walk this path side by side. You're stronger than you think. And the serenade, it's a part of you now. It's part of both of us. Iris felt her heart flutter at his words. She hadn't realized how much she had longed for reassurance, for someone to truly believe in her. Ethan's presence was a quiet balm to her wounded heart, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope ignite deep within her. But how do we even begin? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Ethan smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes, as if he had already begun to understand the weight of their mission. We start small, one step at a time. There are people who need this, who need the healing that the serenade can bring. We'll start by bringing it to them, quietly in small ways, until they're ready to hear it. The idea of taking the serenade beyond the small Arctic town was daunting, but Iris couldn't shake the feeling that this was what she was meant to do. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about something much larger, a ripple of change that could spread across the world, one note at a time. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer uncomfortable. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared bond that had formed in the wake of their journey together. And though Iris was still uncertain, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't do this without Ethan. And perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't meant to. The soft crunch of snow beneath approaching footsteps broke the silence, and Iris turned to see a group of town residents gathering at the edge of the lake. Their faces were illuminated by the faint glow of the northern lights, and their expressions were a mixture of awe and wonder. They had witnessed the lights, the music, the power that had unfolded before them. And now, they stood at the threshold of something new. Iris met Ethan's gaze once more, and in that moment, something shifted. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and they had the serenade. Together, they could bring it to life, share it with the world, and perhaps even change it, one step at a time. We're not alone in this, Iris, Ethan said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Iris nodded, her heart swelling with a new sense of purpose. No, we're not. As the town gathered around them, their faces filled with curiosity and hope, Iris lifted her violin once more, her fingers gliding across the strings. The music flowed effortlessly, a soft, haunting melody that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. It wasn't the grand, powerful serenade from before, but it didn't need to be. It was something quieter, more intimate, a promise of what was to come. And as the music filled the air, Iris knew that the journey they had begun was only the start of something far greater. The serenade was alive, and it was ready to heal. Chapter 11. Reflections of the Past. The town gathered around them, the snow-covered landscape now transformed by the light of the northern auroras. Iris could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her as she played, the delicate notes of her violin floating into the crisp night air. It was a soft, almost hesitant melody, a whisper of what the serenade had been and what it could still become. The music wrapped around them like a shared secret, a bridge between the past and the future, between the pain and the healing they all desperately sought. Iris felt the pull of the serenade within her, but it wasn't as overwhelming as it had been before. The lights were gone now, fading like the last remnants of a dream, and in their place was a quiet stillness, a space for reflection. As she played, her mind wandered, thoughts spiraling out of control. Could this really change everything? Could this melody, simple yet profound, be enough to heal the wounds of so many? The crowd listened in silence, captivated by the soft tones, unaware of the storm that raged inside her. Iris wasn't just playing for them. She was playing for herself. She was trying to understand her own heart, trying to make sense of the tangled threads that had brought her here. Ethan stood by her side, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He seemed to be watching something only he could see, as though the answers were hidden somewhere beyond the shimmering stars. His presence was a steady anchor, and Iris appreciated the quiet comfort it brought her. Though he didn't say a word, she could feel the weight of his gaze. He believed in her, and that belief gave her strength. When the last note faded into the stillness, Iris lowered her violin, her fingers trembling as she set it aside. The crowd remained silent for a long moment, and for a brief instant, she wondered if she had failed them. But then, one by one, the townspeople began to clap. Slow at first, hesitant, as if unsure of what they had just witnessed. And then the applause grew, swelling into a gentle crescendo that seemed to echo across the frozen landscape. It was more than a show of appreciation. It was a recognition of something deeper, something unspoken. The music had reached them in a way words could not, and for the first time in years, Iris felt a sense of connection with these people. They didn't need to understand the full scope of what had just occurred. They didn't need to know the weight of the serenade's power or the legacy it carried. All they needed was the music, the feeling, and the quiet promise that something had changed. Iris turned to Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did they understand?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the remnants of the emotion she had just poured into the performance. Ethan smiled, a rare softness in his expression. "I think they felt it," he said simply. "You don't need to explain it, Iris. The music speaks for itself. It always has." Iris nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in her heart. She had always been afraid of not being enough, of not understanding her own power. But tonight, she had given them a piece of herself, and in return, they had given her something precious, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, chatting quietly amongst themselves, Iris felt a gentle tug at her sleeve. She turned to find Clara, a young girl from the town who had always been a quiet observer, standing at her side. "You were amazing," Clara said, her voice filled with awe. "I've never heard anything like it." Iris smiled, touched by the sincerity in the girl's words. "Thank you, Clara. That means a lot to me." The young girl hesitated, then looked up at Iris with wide eyes. "I don't know if you'll understand this, but when you played, I felt something in my heart. Like everything was better. Like the world was a little bit more beautiful." Iris felt a lump form in her throat at the girl's simple yet profound words. It was as if Clara had just articulated everything Iris had been feeling since the moment she first touched the violin strings. Music had a way of reaching into the soul, of opening doors that had long been closed. And in that moment, Iris realized that the serenade wasn't just about the notes she played. It was about the space it created, the room for people to feel, to heal, to find beauty where they thought it had been lost. "Thank you, Clara," Iris said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly what the serenade was meant to do." Clara smiled, her cheeks flushed from the cold and excitement. I think you'll change the world, Iris. I really do. Iris felt a rush of warmth flood her chest. Could she? Could she truly be a part of something that big? She had once believed her music had no purpose beyond her own grief. But now she saw something different. Now, she saw the possibility of a future where the serenade could heal not just her, but others. It was a dream, yes, but it was one worth chasing. As Clara ran back to join her family, Iris turned to find Ethan watching her, a knowing smile on his lips. "You've done it," he said softly. "You've already changed their world."
"And ours."
Iris nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle within her. But there was still so much left to do. The serenade had begun to take root, but it was only the beginning. There was a world beyond this small town, a world that needed healing, a world that needed the music. "I think it's time we shared it," Iris said, her voice steady now, filled with the quiet determination she hadn't known she possessed. Ethan nodded in agreement. "One step at a time, Iris. We'll take it slow. Let the serenade grow. Let it spread when the time is right." Iris looked up at the sky once more, the northern lights still flickering above, and for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She had Ethan, and she had the serenade, and together, they could bring light to the darkest corners of the world. Chapter 12. A Rhapsody of Hope. The days that followed the serenade felt like a gentle turning of the page, a quiet shift in the rhythm of Iris's life. The town had embraced the music, and with it, Iris's presence, in a way that she hadn't expected. It wasn't the applause that had moved her. It was the way people had spoken of the serenade, how they described the way it made them feel, the way it had brought something alive inside them that they hadn't even known was dormant. The world, Iris realized, was full of people who needed healing, who needed to feel the music. And if she had the power to give that to them, how could she refuse? But even as she found purpose in this new role, uncertainty continued to gnaw at the edges of her heart. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There was still so much about the serenade, and about herself, that she didn't understand. And then there was Ethan. Iris had always known that he was different, that he carried something inside of him that was just as complex and heavy as her own burden. But over the last few days, as they worked together to organize the first small performance of the serenade in the town hall, she had begun to notice a quiet shift in him. There was a deepening of the shadows in his eyes, a hesitation in his voice that hadn't been there before. It was as though the weight of the serenade's legacy was pressing on him too, and he didn't know how to carry it. It worried her, though she didn't know how to bring it up. Ethan had always been the steady one, the one who had kept her grounded when everything felt like it was falling apart. But now, it seemed as though he was beginning to waver under the pressure. Iris stood by the window of the small cabin where they had been staying, her violin resting against the wall beside her. The town was still covered in snow, the trees heavy with the weight of winter, but there was a quiet stillness that had settled over the landscape. The world was asleep, waiting. Ethan entered the room quietly, as if not wanting to disturb her thoughts. His coat was dusted with snowflakes, his breath still visible in the cold air. He was holding something in his hand, a small, leather-bound notebook. Iris looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that day. "I thought we could take a break," Ethan said softly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Maybe go for a walk, clear our heads." Iris frowned slightly, sensing the tension in his posture. He was offering a distraction, but she could see it in his eyes. He was retreating from something. "Ethan, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. He hesitated, his eyes flickering away from hers before he sat down at the small table. He placed the notebook in front of him, his fingers lightly brushing over the cover. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice heavy, "about the serenade, about my father, about what it all means." I don't know if I can live up to it, Iris. The admission startled her, not because she hadn't suspected his inner turmoil, but because she hadn't known how to ask. Ethan had always been the one to lead, to have the answers, to be the guiding force. But now, he was struggling, and she could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the weariness that clung to him like a second skin. I don't understand, Iris said softly, sitting down across from him. You've always believed in the serenade, in its power. You've made it happen. This is what your father wanted, right? Ethan nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It's not just about my father, he said quietly. I thought it was at first. I thought it was enough to carry on his work, to give the serenade a voice. But now, I'm not sure. I've spent my whole life living in his shadow, trying to be the man he wanted me to be. But what if that's not who I am? What if I'm not enough to carry this legacy? Iris felt a pang of sympathy for him, and for the first time, she realized just how deeply Ethan had been affected by the weight of his family's expectations. She had never truly understood the burden he carried, always seeing him as the steady force who kept everything in balance. But now, she saw the cracks beneath the surface, the fear that he wasn't strong enough to bear the weight of the serenade's power. You're enough, Iris said quietly, her voice firm with the truth she had always known. Ethan, you've already done so much. You're not living in your father's shadow. You're creating something new, something that's yours. The serenade isn't just about the past. It's about the future and what you and I can make of it. Ethan met her gaze, his eyes searching hers as though looking for something to hold on to. But what if I fail? He whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his doubt. Iris reached out, her hand resting gently over his. You won't fail, not as long as you're true to yourself. We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we'll face it side by side. The silence that followed was heavy, but comforting. Ethan didn't speak again, but his grip on her hand tightened, as though anchoring himself in the reassurance she had offered. For the first time in a long while, Iris felt a sense of clarity. They didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to carry the weight of the serenade alone. Together, they could face whatever came next. After a long pause, Ethan finally looked up, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Maybe we should take that walk after all. Iris smiled back, a sense of peace settling over her heart. I think that's a good idea. As they stepped outside into the crisp, cold air, the world around them seemed to breathe in time with their steps. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the trees stood like silent sentinels watching over them, and the northern lights flickered overhead, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Ethan had been carrying the weight of his father's legacy for so long, but in this moment, Iris saw a different man. One who was learning to embrace his own path, one who was beginning to understand that the serenade wasn't just his inheritance, it was their shared future. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be doubts and fears and obstacles to overcome. But as Iris walked beside Ethan, she knew one thing for certain. They weren't alone. They had each other, and they had the serenade, a song that had the power to change everything. And with that, the journey had truly begun. Chapter 13, Dancing Under Starlight. The days after their walk felt like a soft unfolding, like the quiet thawing of winter's chill. Iris could feel the shift in the air, a subtle change that had begun the moment they left the small cabin and stepped into the night together. There was something about that evening. The way the stars seemed to burn brighter, the way the northern lights flickered with a renewed intensity that made her believe they were on the cusp of something far greater than she had imagined. It was as though the serenade had become more than a collection of notes or a distant memory of what once was. It was a living thing now, growing with each step they took towards sharing it with others. The townspeople had gathered in the town hall, eager to witness the magic that had begun to whisper through the town. And Iris was no longer just the violinist. She was the keeper of something sacred, something that belonged to everyone, not just her. But even with the excitement and anticipation swirling around her, Iris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to discover, more to learn. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, the sense that the serenade was pulling her in deeper, revealing its mysteries one layer at a time. And yet, there was always that shadow of doubt that lingered in the corners of her mind. What if she wasn't ready? What if they weren't ready? Ethan had sensed it too. She could see it in the way his hands would tremble slightly when he held the notebook, in the way his gaze would drift when they spoke about the future. He had always been the one to provide the answers, but now, even he seemed lost in the uncharted territory ahead of them. It was late one evening, a few days after their walk, when Iris found herself alone in the small rehearsal room of the town hall, the dim light from a single candle casting long shadows across the floor. She had been practicing for hours, the violin in her hands growing familiar once more, the strings vibrating with the weight of her emotions. She didn't need to play to perfection anymore. The music had become an extension of herself, something that flowed from her soul rather than her fingers. She had been playing the same melody for hours, a simple tune that had begun to form in her mind ever since the night of the serenade. But now, as she played, the music began to take on a life of its own. The notes swirled around her, filling the space with a haunting beauty that both comforted and unsettled her. There was a sorrow in the music, a longing that she hadn't expected. The melody was no longer just her own. It was something greater, something older. She stopped abruptly, lowering her violin, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was shaken, but not by the music itself. It was the feeling that had crept into her mind, a feeling of being watched. She glanced around the room, but it was empty, save for the dusty chairs and the shadows that stretched along the walls. Still, the sensation lingered, a strange pressure in the air. And then, she heard it, a soft tap on the door. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make her heart race. "Iris," came a voice, low and hesitant. It was Ethan's. She felt a rush of relief, though the feeling of unease still lingered. "Come in," she called, her voice a little shakier than she intended. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. He looked every bit the same, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, something different in the way he held himself. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the room to where she sat, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his gaze flickering to the violin resting in her lap. Iris nodded, offering him a small smile. "I'm fine. Just playing." Ethan looked at her for a moment longer, as though searching for something in her face. He seemed to reach a conclusion, because he sat down next to her, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and almost too careful, "about the serenade, about everything. I think I might understand what's happening." Iris raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked up at the ceiling, as though the answer was written in the cracks of the wood. "It's not just music, is it?" he said, his words tentative. "It's not just something we can control. The serenade has its own will, its own voice." Iris's heart skipped a beat. She had wondered the same thing but had been too afraid to voice it. "You think it's choosing us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Yes. I don't know how or why, but there's something about the way it's pulling us, about the way the music changes when we play. It's like we're not just creating it, we're following it. And maybe that's why it's so powerful, because it's always been here, waiting." Iris felt a shiver run down her spine. The truth of his words settled in her chest like a weight. The serenade wasn't just something they had uncovered. It had always been there, a part of the town, a part of the land, a part of them. And now, it was asking something of them. Ethan took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was tinged with something like fear. I think it's going to demand more of us, Iris. It's already begun, and I don't know if we're ready. The room felt colder, though the fire in the hearth crackled softly. Iris didn't know what to say. She had been so sure, so certain that the serenade was meant to be a force for good, a way to heal the wounds of the past. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if the music wasn't just a bomb? It was a storm, a tempest that could tear through everything in its path. I don't know if we can control it anymore, Ethan said quietly, his eyes dark and distant. But I do know this. We have to try. Iris nodded slowly, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. There was so much they still didn't understand about the serenade. But they had no choice now. The music was a part of them, and they had to trust it, even if they didn't know where it would lead them. The room grew silent again, save for the crackling of the fire. And as Iris looked at Ethan, she realized that, despite the fear in his eyes, there was something else, something stronger. There was resolve. And together, they would face whatever came next. The serenade was more than they had ever imagined, and it was just beginning. Chapter 14. The Snowlight's Truth. The first snowstorm of the season arrived in the dead of night, swirling through the streets in a silent flurry of white. The winds howled against the windows of the town hall, and the world outside seemed to disappear beneath a blanket of snow. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the distant hum of voices preparing for the serenade. Iris sat in the quiet of the rehearsal room, the violin cradled in her lap, her fingers hovering over the strings. She had been playing the same melody for hours, yet it still felt unfinished. There was something missing, something just out of reach, like a memory that teased at the edges of her mind but wouldn't quite come into focus. She had spent so many nights alone with her music, but tonight felt different. The room felt smaller somehow, the shadows stretching longer, as though the walls were closing in on her. The weight of the serenade pressed on her chest, a constant reminder of the responsibility she had taken on. It wasn't just her music anymore. It was theirs, the town's, the world's. But despite the swelling harmony of the notes, Iris felt a rising unease. It wasn't the music itself. No, the music was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she had ever played before. It was the power behind it, the force that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. The serenade was no longer a simple collection of notes. It was something else, something alive. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The night had been long, and the storm outside only added to the sense of isolation. But she wasn't truly alone. She could feel Ethan's presence, even though he wasn't in the room with her. They had become inseparable in the weeks since the serenade began to take shape. He had always been there, guiding her, offering support, but now, it felt as though they were bound together in a way that was beyond their understanding. The door creaked open behind her, and Iris didn't need to look to know who it was. She felt his presence like a quiet storm, the weight of his gaze as tangible as the cold air that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Iris. Ethan's voice was soft, hesitant. Are you okay? She turned, meeting his eyes for the first time in hours. He looked worn, his dark eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was something else in them, something deeper. A quiet understanding, a shared weight between them. The same weight that had been building ever since they first touched the pages of the serenade. I'm fine, she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She hadn't played in front of him for a while, and now, with the storm raging outside, it felt like they were suspended in time, waiting for something to break. Just Thinking. Ethan nodded, stepping closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he too sensed the tension in the air. About the serenade? Iris nodded, her fingers tightening around the violin. About what comes next? There was a long pause before Ethan spoke again. I've been thinking the same thing. He stepped closer, his presence so near now that she could feel the heat of his body, a stark contrast to the chill in the room. For a moment, they simply stood in silence, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging between them. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if the earth itself was responding to the turmoil in their hearts. I don't know if I can do this, Iris whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I don't know if we're ready. Ethan's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice low but certain. We're in this together. All of us. Iris looked up at him, searching his eyes for the certainty she so desperately needed. There was no turning back now. The serenade had already begun to take shape, and the town was waiting, their hopes and dreams resting on the music they had yet to fully understand. I know, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but it feels like something is just out of reach, like we're being pulled in different directions. Ethan nodded, his gaze distant for a moment, as if he too was feeling the same pull. Maybe that's because we are. Maybe the serenade isn't just a song we're creating. Maybe it's a path we're meant to follow. The idea settled in Iris's mind, slow and steady. The music wasn't just something they controlled. It was guiding them, pushing them towards something greater than themselves, something they couldn't yet see. I think, Iris began, her fingers resting on the strings of her violin, that we're not just playing the serenade. We're becoming it. Ethan's eyes met hers again, and for a brief moment, everything fell away. The storm outside, the pressure building within her, the fear of the unknown. All of it melted into the quiet understanding that they had reached a turning point. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The serenade had chosen them, and now they had to choose it. I think you're right, Ethan said quietly. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Iris smiled faintly, the tension easing slightly in her chest. But it's also the most beautiful. Ethan nodded, and for the first time in days, Iris felt a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't know where the serenade would lead them, or what it would demand of them, but she knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the warmth between them was undeniable. And as Iris lifted her violin once more, the first notes of the serenade filled the room, resonating with a power that seemed to come not from her, but from the very air around them. The music was no longer just a sound. It was a living, breathing thing, and they were merely its instruments. For better or for worse, they were part of it now, and there was no turning back. Chapter 15. A Serenade Forevermore. The day of the Snowlight Serenade arrived with the sky painted in hues of violet and gold. The town, now blanketed in snow, seemed to shimmer with the anticipation of what was to come. The streets were filled with people bundled in scarves and coats, their faces lit with excitement, their breaths misting in the cold air. It was a scene that Iris had seen every year, yet this time, it felt different. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. Inside the town hall, the musicians were gathered, each one tuned and ready, their instruments in hand. The stage had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with icicles hanging from the rafters and soft, glowing lights casting a gentle warmth on the room. But amidst the beauty, Iris could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. The serenade wasn't just a performance. It was a culmination of everything she and Ethan had worked toward, everything they had discovered about each other, about themselves. She stood at the edge of the stage, her violin resting in her hands, the bow poised and ready. Behind her, Ethan was seated at the grand piano, his fingers hovering over the keys, waiting for the signal. There was a quiet understanding between them. No words were needed. This moment was theirs, and only theirs. The town had come to hear their music, but they had come to hear each other, to share in the quiet magic they had created together. Iris closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to breathe deeply, to center herself. She had spent so many nights worrying about this moment, wondering if she could live up to the expectations that had been placed upon her. But now, standing here, with the weight of the town's hopes resting on her shoulders, she realized something. It wasn't about the serenade itself. It wasn't about perfection or grandeur. It was about what it represented. It was about the healing power of music, the way it could bind people together, the way it could transcend time and space. She opened her eyes and looked toward Ethan, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. His presence was a calming force, his unwavering support the anchor she had needed all along. It had taken her so long to realize it, but now she knew. The serenade was not just the story of her journey, it was the story of theirs. Of two people who had been lost in the darkness and had found each other through the light of music. The conductor, a wiry man with a gray beard and spectacles perched on the end of his nose, raised his baton. The room fell silent. And then, the first notes of the serenade filled the air. The sound was like nothing Iris had ever heard. It was as though the very walls of the town hall had come alive, resonating with the music. Each note danced on the air, weaving together the emotions of the past, the present, and the future. There was joy in the music, yes, but also sorrow, longing, and hope. It was a reflection of everything Iris had felt since she arrived in this town, a beautiful, bittersweet melody that held the weight of her journey. As she played, she could feel Ethan's presence in every chord, in every rise and fall of the melody. His fingers moved with precision, creating a harmony that seemed to echo through her soul. They were no longer two separate people, each with their own story. They were one, their hearts intertwined through the music. Iris could hear the townspeople's reactions, soft gasps, a murmur of appreciation, the sound of a few tears being wiped away. She knew that what they were hearing was more than just a concert. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, of the healing power of love. As the serenade reached its crescendo, Iris felt something shift within her. It was as though the music was no longer just a vehicle for her emotions, but an extension of her very being. She was no longer just a musician playing for an audience. She was part of something greater, something that transcended the confines of the stage. She was part of the serenade itself. The final notes lingered in the air, echoing in the silence that followed. The town hall was still, the audience holding their breath, as if afraid to disturb the fragile magic that hung in the room. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. And then, as if released from some unspoken tension, the crowd erupted into applause. Iris lowered her violin, her chest heaving with the effort of the performance. She glanced at Ethan, who was still seated at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything that had been left unsaid between them was understood. They had done it. They had created something beautiful, something that had the power to heal, to change lives. The applause continued, but Iris was no longer focused on the crowd. She was focused on Ethan, on the connection they shared. She had found her voice through him, and he had found his through her. Together, they had created something that went beyond music, beyond performance. They had created a moment that would live on forever. As the applause began to fade, Iris took a step toward Ethan. He stood, and without a word, he extended his hand to her. She placed her hand in his, and together, they walked to the center of the stage, their hearts beating in unison. The crowd rose to their feet, their cheers growing louder, but Iris could barely hear them. All she could hear was the music in her soul, the echo of the serenade that had brought them together. And as they stood there, hand in hand, beneath the shimmering lights of the town hall, Iris realized something. This was not the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. The serenade had been a catalyst, a moment of connection, but there was still so much more to discover, so much more to explore. Together, they had found each other in the music, but there was still a whole world to explore, a world they would face as one. The serenade had brought them together, but it was their love that would carry them forward. And as the final notes of the night echoed in her heart, Iris knew that no matter where life would take them, they would always have the music and the light